her to come on stage and usher us forward. Next up, we have Kalsoom Lakhani coming up. She's the founder and CEO of Invest2Innovate, which was one of the first accelerators in Pakistan. They started in Pakistan, I believe, in 2011, 2012, and now we have 24 accelerators. So that's the kind of growth we've seen over the years. She is also a partner at i2I Ventures, which is a 15 million venture capital fund, and is also the country's first female-led institutional fund. Come on stage, Kalsoom. And everyone put a round of applause for her. Woo!
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Okay. So, I'm here officially launching the Pakistan Startup Ecosystem Report for 2019. This was done in collaboration with the World Bank, specifically the Women's Entrepreneurial Finance Initiative. And I want to give a shout out to our team and everybody that worked on it, and especially Ambreen Beg, our insights lead, and Warda Malik and Arij Mehdi. It was a huge team effort that went into this, a lot of all-nighters. But before I talk about the study and dive in, because you'll be able to download it officially today from our website, and we'll have a QR code. Before I talk about that, I actually want to dive a little bit into, So before I do that, I want to talk about why we're doing this, okay? So first, all of us, how many people have been in the startup ecosystem for 5 years? Okay, a handful. 3 years. 2. The cool thing is that as we're seeing hands go up, is that the startup ecosystem is relatively new. As you guys heard, Invest2Innovate has been part of the startup ecosystem for the last 8 years. There was very few of us in the startup ecosystem when it was really building up. And what's really amazing is that there's been so much activity in Pakistan in the last 8 years, but really even in the last 2 years. And we released a study in 2014, in 2016. This is our 2019 version. And what I think all of us should be proud of in this room, every single person that's been part of this ecosystem, is just how much growth, how much progress. We can see that with, all the announcements that have been happening. We can see that with 021Disrupt itself, and just how many more attendees there are this year than before. And so what's important is that the why is not only the fact that there's been so much growth, but it's also important for us to track that growth. It's important for us to actually know what has been happening in the ecosystem in order for us to also know what is still missing. If we want the Pakistan startup ecosystem to be on the map globally, we also be able to have to say what is missing, what are the current challenges. We need to look at data, and we need to be able to figure out a path forward. So for those of you who are relatively newer to the ecosystem sounds like a really sexy buzzword that we all use. I'm in the ecosystem. A startup does not exist in a vacuum, right? So if a startup wants to succeed, an ecosystem needs to be surrounding them. And a strong ecosystem allows a startup to succeed. But that ecosystem involves multiple pillars, right? What we covered in this study was specifically looking at early stage finance. We looked at the policy and specifically the regulatory gaps for startups and investors alike. And we also looked at support organizations. And what's amazing is kind of just the data itself, right? In 2012, there was actually only 2 major incubators and accelerators that existed in Pakistan. Obviously, there was a lot of other programs that happened and competitions and things like that, and no significant, that's a really key word, funding sources or investors. Fast forward 7 years later, there's now 24 major incubators and accelerators, 20 formal investors and funds, and 80 co-working spaces across Pakistan. I think we should all just give a round of applause to the fact that the ecosystem has grown that much, right? But also when we want to dive in, let's go a little bit deeper. So when we talk about the role of support organizations are incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces, associations. When we talk about specifically the role of government in that, obviously for those of us who've been involved in the ecosystem for a long time, know that the Punjab Information Technology Board launched Plan 9, the first major technology incubator, Plan X as well. But the federal government, specifically under the IT ministry and specifically Ignite, launched these public-private partnerships called the National Incubation Centers. These NICs, which now exist across Pakistan in all of the major cities, have now actually graduated about 234 startups since 2016. When we talk about the role of corporates are also evolving in Pakistan. So they've gone from still, and they still do this, but are sponsoring a lot of other startup organizations and things that are happening in the ecosystem. We obviously see that in the sponsors for this, this conference. But also what we're seeing is them evolving and launching corporate VC funds. I'm thinking about TPLE Ventures, but also thinking about like launching their own accelerators like Telenor Velocity. And of course, the private sector, obviously we're from there, so I'm like smiling, yes, plays a very strong role in the startup ecosystem. So when we look at these support organizations, these incubators and accelerators, if we were only looking at Eye2Eye, our accelerator, and the Nest.io, we've actually graduated a combined total of over 200 startups that have raised about $11 million in funding. Yeah. Thanks. All right. But let's dive into another pillar. So when we look at finance, we specifically for this study actually looked at deals and investments that were reported, as well as what startups told us, what was disclosed to us by investors. We actually triangulated that data as much as we could to try to get as much information as we could, and all of that, not the specific deals, but the aggregate information is all in the study. But we calculated about 101 deals total, which was about $165 million that were raised in the Pakistani startup ecosystem from 2015 to 2019. And that number for this presentation has been adjusted. We did our best because obviously Airlift was a major announcement yesterday of $12 million. Telotalk announced, Priceoy announced. So we try to put it in the presentation, though keep in mind that the report was written as of a week ago. So there was very little we could do to change it, but just keep that in mind when you're reading it. But just to give you a sense of how much investment has been raised. And if we look at specifically 2018 and 2019, just the last 2 years in Pakistan, we've actually seen 47 deals happen. And so when we look at this, right, this actually looks like 2015 was crazy, $80 million. But actually what was interesting was that there was outliers in 2015. So when we look at the Zameen raise, we look at classifieds that raised in that year, that's actually why that number is so high. If we were to take those out, the number is actually much smaller, and the majority of deals that were raised were actually in the pre-seed and seed level. What's interesting now, and this graph does not depict the Airlift raise, Priceoy, Telotalk that were just announced. In 2019, we're still only in the last quarter, but actually with their amounts, 2019 has already surpassed 2018, and these were deals that were just announced in the last week, guys. So imagine what can happen in the next 3 months, which is really exciting. We're also seeing the number of deals open to actually increasing, but we saw obviously 33 that happened in 2018. If we were to just zoom in again in the 47 deals, most of the deals are still happening in the seed stage level and the pre-seed level. We are obviously seeing Series A happen like in Baikia, in Airlift, and what those deals also showcase, even with Series A, is that Series A wasn't often happening in Pakistan. So what's really great is the signaling of what's happening with international investors coming into companies like Baikia and in Airlift. And I think hopefully that's a signal for the future ecosystem, and hopefully for these companies that are raising seed investment will hopefully be able to raise Series A and inshallah Series B in the future. So this is how we broke it down, right? We look at grants. We actually think about this when we were doing our research and analysis. We were thinking about this as a capital curve, right? A startup cannot, immediately raise Series A necessarily, but they need to go through. Sometimes grants play a very strong role in high risk, no return capital. We saw that 29% of the deals in 2018 and 2019 was from grants and donors, and they play a very strong role in this ecosystem. We see the role of angels because they're often the first money in, right? And then obviously the role of VCs. We've seen a lot of new entrants of VC funds in the market, us included, and 30% of the overall funding raised from 2018 and 2019 was actually from VC funds. So I'm going to talk about the gaps and challenges because I just framed all this amazing stuff that's happening, but we still have a long way to go. There's actually a lot of things that we need to do to actually change everything. So when we talk about support organizations, when we looked at the interviews, when we looked at the data that we collected from surveys that we did, according to most stakeholders, especially investors, ultimately support organizations, particularly incubators and accelerators, need to be doing a better job of actually improving the value that they provide to startups. Specifically, instead of actually for organizations concentrating on the number of startups that they graduate, they need to actually concentrate on the value that they provide the startups, right? What is the overall outcome versus the outputs? And that's actually something that's a really important thing for support organizations to take away. Entrepreneurs interviewed also said that mentorship services and matchmaking should overall be improved in the ecosystem and by those programs. We can also see that funding is something that all of us rely on international grants, and hopefully sustainability is something that people should play a role in. This is what's really interesting. So obviously I was showing you some deal flow data, but what's really interesting is that the early stage capital gap, despite the numbers that I just showed you, still very much exists. A lot of it is in the pre-seed and seed level, which means we need more players in the space. So even though everything is really exciting, we just need more. But we also need more higher quality, right? We don't need investors that are going to be taking 60 or 70% of a company, because when we think about the capital curve, that will obviously stop a startup from being able to raise their next round of investment. And then obviously startups, when we did actually interview them, they did say that the investment raising process is still very difficult. And obviously the policy environment, right? When we interview startups, investors, anyone who's operating in the ecosystem, what they all say is that the policy environment is not favorable for startups or investors alike. And oftentimes when we think about it, even though the Doing Business Index that came out for 2020 actually improved us, I think by 28 spots, I think. And now we're at 108 out of 190. And while that's to be celebrated, that's still 108 out of 190. There's a lot more room for growth. And specifically, when we talk about funds, local funds, if we want more capital to come into the market, if we want to improve the early stage finance gap, if we want to see success stories emerge from this market, we actually need to create an environment for investors that is more favorable from a policy perspective. Specifically right now, improving and iterating the private funds legislation of 2015 in order to allow more funds to be able to domicile inside of Pakistan, improving state bank regulations to allow money to flow easily in and out of Pakistan, because currently right now most funds outside of Lakhani are actually domiciled outside, which means that they cannot actually leverage the money that's inside Pakistan in their fundraising process. So if we actually want to improve the capital gap, we actually need to improve the environment for investors. The biggest discontent, obviously, for entrepreneurs is taxation. I think it's probably a discontent everywhere for startups. But we also need to create a one-window solution that's beyond just your NTN and business registration. We need to think about how taxation, how other things can all fall under this one-window solution. And because we were supported and collaborated with the Women's Entrepreneurial Finance Initiative, we also took a gender lens in this study, right? We did a concentration of looking at women-led companies and women-led companies that had raised funding, as well as startups that had raised funding altogether. So ultimately, when we look globally, we know that there is a gap, right? 17% of venture capital investments were in women-led companies. In Pakistan, out of the $165 million that I just quoted earlier, only about 3% was in women-led businesses, but the number of deals is actually increasing. So that's actually a positive sign. And also, when we looked and talked to investors, 75% of our investors said that there was no difference between the quality of female-led companies and ones led by men, but oftentimes they weren't seeing enough women-led companies. So we also need to be doing work on actually improving the funnel and actually increasing the volume of women-led companies and female entrepreneurs. And so when we look at that, that's actually reflecting in the number. And I have 2 minutes. Jahan, are you happy? Woohoo. All right. So guys, this is how you can access the report. I've given you little bits of snippets, things like that. Our team that's in the front all has QR codes on the back if you guys want to download the report. You can also raise your camera and actually get the QR code on your camera, and it immediately goes to our website. But if you go to invest2innovate.com, the number 2, we're not eye to eye, the Tahir Shah song, sadly, but invest2innovate.com, you'll be able to get a quick link to the insights page and be able to download the report and hopefully be able to educate yourself. But I think altogether what we should all be proud of is the fact that we've had so much tremendous growth. I know I am, as all of us who've been players in the startup ecosystem, but we all know that we can improve ourselves to make this even better and to see success stories like all of you emerge. Thank you.